You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening in once again. We want to get into the latest on cover crop research out of K-State's Department of Agronomy, and this was shared at a recent soil health workshop that was put on here in Manhattan by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They covered a gamut of topics, and one of those was the rotations where cover crops will fit productively here in Kansas, specifically a no-till wheat, sorghum, soybean rotation. Kraig Roozeboom is with us once more, cropping systems agronomist at Kansas State University. Now, Kraig, we've visited about cover crops and the rotation alternatives and options many a time here, but the research continues to build in this area, doesn't it?
Right. It is an opportunity to look back over the past 10-plus years that we've had this in place, and so we've had this experiment running now since 2007. The treatments have cycled through the plots for 3 complete cycles of the rotation, so it's a good time to take a step back and see what that body of data is telling us at this point in time. And just to point ahead a little bit, we are making some changes to these treatments a little bit for the next few cycles of the rotation, and so it's an opportunity to take a look at this. What have we learned so far, and how are things moving with the research we've been doing?
Now, one important variable here, of course, among many, where are these cover crops inserted into the rotation we're talking of here?
Well, you mentioned a wheat, sorghum, soybean, and obviously you're harvesting wheat in June. Sorghum goes in the next May or even June in some years, so it's a long fallow period. Some of that happens even in July and August when we're still getting a relatively decent amount of rain. Yeah, we often think of July and August being hot and dry, but if you look at our annual precip distribution, there's still a fair amount of rainfall. And in terms of fallow efficiency, and that refers to how much water you're storing during fallow, the longer a field is in fallow, the less efficient it tends to become, because once that profile gets full of water, you're no longer storing more water, right? It starts running off. And so that's a good window. If you've got a mixture of the cool season wheat with the warm season sorghum and or soybeans, there's a window of opportunity after that wheat and before the sorghum. Another thing to think about is you're going from a grass crop to another grass crop, so maybe there's an opportunity to insert a broadleaf crop in between there. And so all these things come together to where that seems like a natural fit in our cropping systems to put this in. There's been previous work done in south central Kansas showing that can be a successful system. And so we wanted to build on that when we set this up and look at more of this 3-year rotation. Not only how does it affect that immediate sorghum crop, but what about the soybeans that come after the sorghum and back around to the wheat, and what about if we keep it in place for several cycles? How sustainable is that? What's the impact primarily on sorghum, but on the other crops as well?
So this has been conducted here in Manhattan, this latest round of research.
That's right, just south of town. We often refer to the Ashland Bottoms Research Farm. It's down on a Wymore silty clay, and so it's a decent silt loam soil at the surface, but it gets to a heavy clay fairly quickly as you move down. Nothing like the clay pans you have in southeast, but it is a dense clay in the subsoils. And so we've done it there. We instituted it in 2007, and it hasn't been tilled since that time. I think it was tilled when the wheat crop went in the fall of 2006, and we've not tilled it since.
Well, what are then, Kraig, the cover crop alternatives you've looked at in that window between the wheat and the grain sorghum?
Right. So obviously the check we're doing the comparisons against would be just chemical fallow. Leave that residue in place. There's a lot of good information saying that wheat residue layer is a great seed bed for that next spring sorghum crop. Okay, that's our check. As I said, though, we got some water. We got some heat that we're not utilizing if we just leave it alone. And so another alternative, not necessarily a cover crop, is to plant double crop soybeans. And obviously the further south and east you get, the more common that gets. But that happens in this geography and even further north than where we are here. And that gives you the opportunity to intensify that rotation, insert a broadleaf between the two grass crops, but also harvest potentially a cash
So that
crop.
is harvested.
Right, double crop soybeans. So we've harvested that every year. And just while we're talking about it, the average over the 10-plus years we've done that has been just less than 25 bushels per acre. It's been as low as 2 or 3 bushels, and we had some 50-bushel double crop soybeans one year, and another year 40 bushels, so a couple of pretty good years. And so it's pretty variable, but that's a nice alternative to leaving it alone. And as we look at economics, it's hard to beat because you do get some cash return out of that system, especially if you look at the economics of the cover crops where we're not grazing them. And I think across the state and the region, as cover crops have increased in popularity, one of the things that helps make them work in producer systems is grazing them. That makes a lot of sense, and if you've got the animal resource to utilize that, you can get a lot of the same benefits plus get animal gain out of it. We weren't looking at that in this experiment. We were just looking at the, I would call it, true cover crop where we leave it in place, don't graze it, don't harvest it. So we're comparing that to chemical fallow where we don't do anything except control weeds, double crop soybeans where we plant soybeans, harvest them for grain, and that harvest typically takes place in late October, early November. And then we had 4 treatments that were indeed cover crops. And so when we set this up, we wanted to be kind of systematic and have 2 summer cover crops that should put on most of their growth during those warm summer, July and August months and into September. And so we had a non-legume, and that was sorghum sudan. And so it may not make a lot of sense putting a sorghum relative ahead of sorghum. Indeed, our results bear that out. It may not be the best fit, but it has the potential to produce a lot of biomass. And one of the things we want to accomplish most often in cover crops anyway is capture carbon from the atmosphere and get it into the soil, into plant residue, and eventually into the soil. And so that was the idea behind that. Improve our soil organic matter.
And was the sorghum sudan chopped?
They were left in place. Okay. And we would roll them down. The sorghum sedans, we'd roll it down in mid-September, about when it was just starting to head, try to prevent head formation. And so you'd have a nice mat of residue out there, which actually was a little bit of a problem when it come planting into. But it sure maintained soil moisture, which we can talk into more. And it suppressed weeds pretty nicely as well. Dr. Dilley and some of her students collected data early on in the study showing, and observations over the years would say the more residue you have out there from that cover crop, the fewer winter annual weeds you tend to have ahead of sorghum. And so you can maybe save one of those early burn down herbicide applications ahead of planting.
And the other summer crop was?
Soybeans. But we're not talking double crop soybeans. We're just talking a cover crop soybeans that typically was either a forage type or at the very least a very late maturing group 5, group 7 soybean, so that it wouldn't set pods until September or so. And so at about the time we're rolling down that sorghum sudan and it's starting to head, we're also rolling down those soybeans to prevent seed formation and pod formation on those. And so the idea there was now we've got a legume in between the 2 grass crops. Maybe we're fixing some nitrogen, keeping nitrogen more available in the system. One of the reasons for that choice was the previous work that had been done primarily at Heston, Kansas by Mark Clausen years ago. And he was just looking at a wheat-sorghum rotation. You put a legume cover crop between the wheat and the sorghum, you could apply less nitrogen to that sorghum and get similar yields. So we've got a non-legume and a legume summer cover crop, and then we had the same split in the winter species. And so the non-legume there, rather than a grass, we went to brassicas, and initially it was canola, and after the first couple of years it's been radishes. And so you've heard about tillage radish or nitro radish, and that was the idea there, that you get that benefit of the taproot, again a low seed-in ratio residue, so it cycles nutrients more quickly. Experience and observation says it provides a beautiful no-till seed bed for that sorghum the next spring, pretty nice weed suppression. That was our winter non-legume. And then the winter legume initially for a couple of years was winter pea. Had some mixed success with that, and so we've transitioned to crimson clover. Most years it'll frost or die over the winter, but on mild winters, 2012 was an example where the crimson clover survived and we had significant spring growth.
That's the layout of the multi-year research that K-State's been conducting on cover crops in a wheat, sorghum, soybean rotation. And Kraig, we need to take a break. When we come back, we want to dig into some of the key findings on such things as the nitrogen benefits, water use, and so forth.
Okay.
Kraig Roozeboom with us, cropping systems agronomist here at the university. We'll return with Kraig shortly here on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today resumes now as we're conversing with a K-State cropping systems agronomist about information that he recently shared at a soil health workshop hosted by the NRCS here in Manhattan, where he passed along the latest results from multi-year research on cover crops and where they can fit handily into, in this case, a wheat, sorghum, soybean rotation. Kraig, you hinted at several of the key interests within this work, and one of those was the ensuing impact on nitrogen requirements of the crop typically to follow that cover crop, and that would be sorghum.
Right, so we're following the wheat with sorghum. We're inserting the cover crops between the two. And similar to what Mark Clausen and others who've done some of the similar work, if you put a summer legume, and in our case it was this late maturing soybean, in that system we could maximize our sorghum yield with about 40 pounds less nitrogen fertilizer applied to that sorghum crop. So after the different cover crops, we had 5 rates of nitrogen applied. So we had a good measure of that nitrogen response of sorghum after the various treatments we imposed. Interestingly enough, the double crop soybeans, which we were harvesting for grain, wasn't that far behind. In other words, it could also provide a little bit of a benefit to that sorghum. And so is it truly nitrogen fixation, or is it just the fact that you've got less of the nitrogen in the system tied up in residues, or it's cycling more quickly? I think we don't necessarily have the answer to that, because even now in our general crop rotation, the soil fertility guys will say may not be so much the fixation, it's just the fact that it's cycling more quickly with that soybean residue. The other summer cover crop we had in there, I kind of alluded to the fact that maybe putting a sorghum sedan ahead of a sorghum crop may not be a great idea. We did see a benefit, maybe some slight indication of greater soil carbon near the surface, but it was at the cost of needing to add an extra 40 pounds of N to maximize our sorghum yields.
And that could have been expected by and large?
That's typically expected. The more carbon you put in the system, the more nitrogen it takes to process that carbon and move it into the organic matter fraction, etc. Typically, if we put enough nitrogen on, the yields were not that far behind. The sorghum yield following that sorghum sedan versus the sorghum yield following the other cover crops. I think there was a little bit of a lag even at those high end, but the fact that we could get almost there tells me for the most part, it's not that we're using a lot of water that's pulling these yields down. It's the nitrogen cycling primarily. We talked about the 2 winter cover crops, the legume, the non-legume, both low seed-in, should be cycling nitrogen fairly quickly. What we found is that those just didn't get enough biomass, probably, was the key driver, and not enough fixation to really have a huge impact on sorghum yields. Some years they kind of behave like our summer legumes and give us a nitrogen benefit. Some years almost the opposite, especially if they continued growth into the spring in those mild winters. And so over time, on average, they kind of weren't all that different from the sorghum response. After those was not all different than sorghum in a chem-fallow system.
Which is rather interesting. But again, it speaks volumes about the legume in that function anyway, and how that can help out that following sorghum crop.
That's right, the summer legume,
right,
where you've got enough time.
Of course, when we talk of cover crops within any rotation, one of the things that the producer is always curious about, to say the least, is are those crops influencing the availability of water to the subsequent crop? And the use of water by those cover crops is key to making the system work. What did you find in a general vein there, Kraig?
Right. So most of our cropping systems are water limited here in the state. And so anytime you put another crop in that system, you're going to use some water. That's a question, and now we've got 10 years of data, of yield data, and as I said earlier, most of the time if we put enough nitrogen on, didn't matter what was ahead of it, we could get similar sorghum yield. So that's one indicator in my mind that water is not the driving factor. Another thing is, over the past 10 years, one of those years was 2012, which was a record-breaking drought year. And so if you look at the crop response in that year, you'll see that only one of our cover crop treatments actually pulled down sorghum yield, less than the check chem-fallow. And even then it was not much of a decrease.
That was the winter legume, is that correct?
That was the winter legume, very mild winter, and so it survived the winter, continued growth into the spring. Potentially, we weren't measuring soil water at that time, but potentially extracted some water right ahead of sorghum planting and had a negative impact on sorghum yield. Slightly negative, not huge, but somewhat negative. All the other treatments were either neutral, completely neutral. In other words, their yield of the sorghum was no different, or was actually enhanced. Just when we had the legumes ahead of that sorghum, it enhanced yield, even in that very dry year. And so, again, those legume cover crops were terminated that previous fall. We had time for recharge. And so that's an indicator that in our environment, and that's the key factor, we're in a 35-inch annual precip location, and you move west and precip goes down, things could be very different.
Sure.
So that spurred additional interest, and so in a couple of years we actually measured soil profile water content with the help of some colleagues in the department, Dr. Klutenberg, the soil physicist. We picked a nitrogen rate that would reflect a typical application rate to chem-fallow and got us close to maximizing yield no matter what the cover crop treatment was. And we measured soil water content. And we found that, sure enough, as you would expect, when those cover crops or the double crop is growing, soil water content goes down, less than the chem-fallow. And so all summer long into September, they separate out, and you have less water where there's a cover crop growing, even though we're still in those wetter, higher precip months. Terminate those in September, and we kept measuring it weekly and then less frequently over the winter. And where we had a fair amount of biomass over the summer, they start recharging even in the fall, assuming you get the rainfall, and we were able to measure recharge. About when the fall came on is then when those cool season cover crops really start kicking in, and they start pulling it down even more on into the fall. But once you kind of get over the hump, and everything, in the 2 years we did this, everything pretty much died over the winter, even the winter cool season cover crops. And you get into the spring, and by the time we got to May and we're about ready to start planting sorghum, in 1 year, soil water content in the profile had fully recharged. The next year, it hadn't quite. Now, those were in 2 years where we had pretty nice spring rains. This year is quite different.
Right.
And so we'll see, but by the same token, we don't have actively growing cover crops. And so just those moisture dynamics, I think every year is going to be different. And I think that's why having a dynamic approach to this in terms of what cover crop you put in, how you manage it, I think you need to reflect what's going on in terms of the precipitation environment as well. Long story short, the soil water data we collected confirmed, in my mind in a way, our conclusion that water is typically not limiting that sorghum yield.
Well, Kraig, this has involved research. In the final analysis, though, it speaks favorably of most of these cover crop alternatives placed in that rotation following wheat and ahead of grain sorghum.
Right. I think one of the ways I like to think about it is this research has demonstrated that we can successfully use cover crops in our systems without having a negative impact on the rest of our crop rotation. We haven't talked about the soybeans and the wheat, but our data would say that we're not having a negative impact on them, definitely. And in that very dry year, actually having a cover crop in that system 2 years or 3 years previously was a net benefit to those crops. So not only can we do it with either no negative yield response, possibly a positive yield response, or maybe a reduction in our nitrogen rate if we're talking about those summer legumes. So that's all good in terms of the crop response. And then you start thinking about the fact that maybe we're cutting out 1 or 2 herbicide applications, or 3. And again, we haven't had as much movement on organic matter or other soil structural or biological characteristics, but there's other data out there that would say that we're potentially having a positive impact on our soil structure, or at least we're not having a negative impact. I think all of those things would add up to saying, okay, we can have some of these other what are typically called ancillary benefits, and at the same time either have no net negative benefit on our crop yields and potentially even some positive results.
Kraig, thanks for the summary of this work. Appreciate it as always.
Very good, Eric. Glad to do it.
He is cropping systems agronomist Kraig Roozeboom of K-State, and he talked of what they've discovered concerning cover crops in a no-till wheat, sorghum, soybean rotation, with that cover crop being inserted between the wheat and the sorghum, at a recent soil health workshop, which was hosted by the Natural Resources Conservation Service here in Manhattan. We'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
As you well know, homes come in all different sizes and shapes, and so does the affordability of landscapes.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
In 1980, I published an extension publication, Residential Landscape Design. I think it has been quite a popular publication with a wide audience, even outside the state. I wrote it during 1979. And had a student to help me with the artwork. We made a great team working together on a publication to help homeowners understand what it takes to create a home landscape which makes living better and once implemented would increase property values. If not directly in monetary gain, surely in curb appeal. As I wrote the publication, I kept homeowners in mind. It had to be an attractive publication, but even more so, informative. And of course, we had a limited budget. And that, together for me, was the trick. Of course, there were already so many books on the market explaining home landscape design. Books with beautiful photos, which would inspire any serious homeowner to take charge and create a landscape. But that was not the intent of an extension publication. Originally, the publication was free. Later, we charged $1.25 for all 105 pages. The publication was intended to be a catalyst to make people interested in improving the landscape of their property. As you well know, homes come in all different sizes and shapes, and so does the affordability of landscapes. A good landscape is not cheap. Quality plant material costs money, and it is an investment. One can keep costs down by buying smaller plants and expecting them to grow. The mature landscape may take several years to fill in. However, one has to start somewhere. As I wrote the publication, I placed myself in the homeowner's position and tried to anticipate the questions they would ask. To clarify thoughts, we use simple sketches. The sketches are pencil sketches, black and white, clearly labeled. When I opened the first page and looked at contents again, I reread the 8 steps I used to take to help people through the process. Even looking at it today, I see that it makes sense. There's a step-by-step thinking process. On page 23, figure 21, it says, when selecting a tree or shrub, always consider its mature height and shape. The 4 sketches show a small tree just planted with a baby in a stroller. Then the tree has grown somewhat, and the grown baby, now a teenager, is on his bike, looking at it. Then there is a grown tree with 2 lovers walking underneath it. The last sketch is now a big tree with an old, slightly stooped man with a walking stick standing beneath it. You know, at times I'll feel like that old man. It doesn't seem that long ago that I wrote that publication. The student who worked with me has long graduated, married, raised his family, and built a successful nursery business. He too is getting on in age. I wonder if he still has one of the original publications. Christy told me the other day she had only 10 left or so. We've had, of course, many reprints, but those 10 I better put aside and autograph. But now, a recent graduate student has taken the publication, as well as many others written at other state universities, and he has compared and tried to sort out what made them good, better, or outstanding. Then look at and study how they could be improved upon. Now think back to 1980 and today, 2018, with all the computer skills and capabilities and our different attitude towards reading. Even the landscape design has changed. Yes, even the use of plant material. So to sit down and take a close look and be critical is a good thing, as long as it still serves the public extension serves, and not some ego of a writer. Remember, this is an extension publication. It is for the people. The presentation of the new approach was last Friday. I had made a note on my calendar to not forget to attend. However, I couldn't make it. I was not going to spread the last of my flu bug. Oh yes, I managed to get the flu, even though I'd had my shot. I'm going back to ask for my money back. Just to show you where we are today compared to 1980, Christy, my secretary, sent me the computer link to the classroom where the presentation was to be held. Hesitant as I was, I made a few clicks and followed the instructions. And yes, a little after starting time, my computer screen showed images I could follow of the ongoing presentation. Quite a nice reference was made to my original publication. I accept that an old publication can be and should be improved upon as long as the intent does not get lost. Help the people with solving home landscape issues, challenges, and stimulate the horticultural industry. Because remember, if a publication does not give the kickstart, then the industry has the professional landscape designers or landscape architects who can help. But extension is the outreach to the people to help them help themselves. It's a gift if you're good at it, and very satisfying.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. With that, our Wednesday edition comes to a close. As always, thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.